Section B, introductory clauses and phrases.
When a sentence begins with an introductory clause or phrase, a lot of times it's going to be separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. But what's an introductory clause or phrase, you ask? Well, there are lots of different kinds. We'll take you step by step through these introductory things such as introductions, prepositional phrases, participial phrases, and subordinate clauses. We'll make sure you not only know how to spot them, but also how to use them in a sentence. The first one we're going to look at is the interjection.
An interjection is a word or phrase that shows strong emotion, and by itself it usually ends in an exclamation point. Sometimes, however, we might want to use an interjection to kick off a sentence. Take a look at this.
Wow, that's a big hunk of butter.
Although there's nothing wrong here, there is another way we can write the sentence. If we drop the first exclamation point and replace it with a comma, we can slide this on over, and voila! Now instead of making wow a complete sentence, we're using it to introduce the next sentence, giving us wow, that's a big hunk of butter.
Remember when we said that commas usually show us where we should pause when reading a sentence? Here the comma gives the reader a chance to think, okay, something amazing must be coming if we started the sentence with wow. And what's more amazing than a big hunk of butter?
I'll tell you what's more exciting than a big hunk of butter. Clauses and phrases. And a lot of times the best way to start a sentence is with an introductory phrase or clause.
A phrase is a group of closely related words that doesn't have both a subject and a predicate, and it usually functions as a single unit in a sentence.
A clause, on the other hand, has a subject and a predicate, and it can either stand alone or it can lean on a complete sentence for support. We'll go into clauses more in a little bit. First, we need to talk about a couple of different types of phrases we might run into, namely the prepositional phrase and the participial phrase.
A prepositional phrase is made up of a preposition and the noun that comes right after it, along with any articles or adjectives that are hanging on for the ride. Look at this sentence. Cecilia fell into the jaws of that huge carnivorous plant. Here we have two prepositional phrases, into the jaws and of that huge carnivorous plant. The first one is made up of the preposition into, its noun jaws, and the article the. The second prepositional phrase is made up of the preposition of, the noun plant, and all of plant's adjectives, that, huge, and carnivorous.
In that example, the prepositional phrases are in the middle and at the end of the sentence. And notice that there's not much fanfare, no special punctuation marks are needed. But when a sentence begins with the prepositional phrase, you can put the comma between it and the rest of the sentence. This is one of the cases where using a comma is optional.
It's optional.
It's optional.
Want to see what we mean?
Under the baobab tree, we will find savory grubs.
Notice we used a comma after the introductory prepositional phrase, under the baobab tree. If we had said, we'll find savory grubs under the baobab tree, we would not use a comma since the prepositional phrase is at the end of the sentence, not at the beginning. And remember, we could have also written, under the baobab tree, we'll find savory grubs, leaving the comma off. Ultimately, whether or not you use a comma after an introductory prepositional phrase is entirely up to you. If you think the meaning of the sentence is pretty clear, feel free to leave the comma out. But if you think the sentence is confusing without a comma, by all means put one in. Remember, it's optional.
Another kind of phrase we can use to kick off a sentence is a participial phrase. A participle is a verb that functions as an adjective in a sentence and usually ends in either ing or ed. The words associated with a participle in a sentence combine with it to form a participial phrase. Look at this sentence.
The starving piranha swam away to look for a tasty treat.
Here, starving is a participle, since it's a form of the verb starve that's being used as an adjective to describe the noun piranha. What kind of piranha? A starving piranha. Notice that all we had to do to form the participle was add an ing to the end of the verb. So that's a participle. A participial phrase is made up of a participle and the words that go with it. Let's add a couple words to our participle starving. Starving after skipping breakfast. Now we have a participial phrase. The participle starving and the related words after skipping breakfast.
Now that we know what a participial phrase is, We can make a rule. Whenever a participial phrase is used to begin a sentence, we have to use a comma to separate it from the rest of the sentence. And it isn't optional. That's why in our sentence, starving after skipping breakfast, comma, the piranha swam away to look for a tasty treat. We've used a comma after the word breakfast, since it's the last word of our participial phrase.
So, those are the introductory phrases that use commas, the prepositional phrase and the participial phrase. Remember, using commas after an introductory prepositional phrase is optional, but using a comma after an introductory participial phrase is not optional.
We now know little something about introductory phrases and when we should use a comma. Now it's time to look at the introductory clause. But before we go into using clauses to introduce a sentence, we need to talk about the many kinds of clauses roaming around out there.
An independent clause is one that can stand on its own as a complete sentence. In fact, anytime you hear us say independent clause, you can basically think of it as a complete sentence. So most sentences like Jennifer loves to talk on the telephone are actually independent clauses.
On the other hand, a dependent clause has a subject and a predicate but cannot stand alone. It has to be connected to an independent clause in order to make sense.
If we wrote, although Jennifer loves to talk on the telephone, notice that we can't stick a period on the clause and let it stand by itself. Now it's a dependent clause, so to make it work, we have to connect it to an independent clause. Like, she is never one to gossip. Now we have a complete sentence. Although Jennifer loves to talk on the telephone, comma, she is never one to gossip. This puppy's made of a dependent clause that is leaning on an independent clause for support.
There are many ways to make a dependent clause. Sometimes a subordinated conjunction is used to show how the dependent clause relates to the sentence to which it's attached. In fact, we just used one. Remember when we said, although Jennifer loves to talk on the telephone? You guessed it. Although is a subordinated conjunction, since it made the clause, Jennifer loves to talk on the telephone, dependent. And while some of my favorite subordinated conjunctions are after, wherever, unless, and as long as, there are a lot more from which to choose. Pretty much any conjunction you can put in front of a sentence that keeps it from being able to stand alone is a subordinating conjunction.
And when we use a subordinating conjunction to head off a dependent clause, we call the whole shebang a subordinate clause. So if we tag until to the beginning of the independent clause, the cows come home, we get until the cows come home, which can't stand on its own, so it's a dependent clause. And because we've made it with a subordinating conjunction until, it's also a subordinate clause.
Now that we know what a subordinate clause is, we can make a rule about how we use them with commas.
When a subordinate clause is used to head off a sentence, it is always followed by a comma. Don't you love rules that have the word always in them?
Let's use the subordinate clause we just made about cows in a sentence.
Until the cows come home, the pigs will plan the revolution.
Here we have our subordinate clause, until the cows come home. Tagged onto the independent clause, the pigs will plan the revolution. According to the rule we just made, we absolutely have to put a comma after a subordinate clause, right there between home and the.
So now we know to use commas after all kinds of introductory phrases, including prepositional phrases, participial phrases, and subordinate clauses. At this point, we should bring up a trap that's easy to fall into, and that's trying to put a comma after a plain old subject. Look at this sentence.
The short mushrooms with the red caps and pretty blue spots are poisonous.
Our subject here is the short mushrooms with the red caps and pretty blue spots. Pretty long, huh? Since we have such a long subject, we might be tempted to put a comma in between it and the rest of the sentence just to break things up a bit. But if you look at the subject more closely, you see that we don't have any introductory phrases or clauses, just a subject, and that's no place for a comma.
Generally speaking, commas are used to tell the reader where to pause and to visually separate parts of a sentence that might otherwise run into each other. There are basically 4 times we use commas.
The first way we can use commas is to separate items in a list. When commas are used this way, they're basically just standing in for the word end. The one time we don't use commas to separate items in a list is when we're listing adjectives right before the noun we're describing. Then we don't use commas.
The second time we use commas is after introductory phrases and clauses, when we basically just want to separate the introductory elements from the rest of the sentence. The introductions we talked about were interjections, prepositional phrases, participial phrases, and subordinate clauses.
Okay, you know all the do's and don'ts when using commas in introductory phrases and clauses. Now let's look at a third way commas can be used, and that's to interrupt a sentence already in progress.